Well, welcome again to Friday Fundamentals, and it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. This is part three of our subject, the danger of open fellowship. So let me just briefly bring you up to date on what was said in the first two presentations on this topic of open fellowship. We began by sharing that fellowship is both an Old Testament and New Testament concept. And I want to spend just a little bit of time on the Old Testament concept of fellowship and then show you the danger of open fellowship, even from an Old Testament perspective, and then close out by addressing Paul's admonition in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 11. The first presentation said that fellowship began with God and Adam. That they had fellowship. They had a joint participation, and there was even impartation and partation, which caused them to have a fellowship. But God has always been concerned about the danger of open fellowship. And God has always warned his people to avoid open fellowship with those who had different beliefs and practices. If you just read Deuteronomy chapter 7, where God instructed the children of Israel to destroy the Canaanite culture. And I don't want to spend too much time because these Friday fundamentals are supposed to be short talks. But I think part of the problem that we have now is we're living in a culture where open fellowship with those who practice differently is accepted. But from Scripture, God has always distinguished between his people and others who practice differently. In Deuteronomy 7, starting verse 1, when the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and has cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, the Girgahites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them, and shalt make no covenant, or thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Let me show you how deep this was with God. So not only was the religious practices to be avoided, but in verse 3, neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. And then God gives the reason. For they will turn away from thy son from following me, or they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you and destroy thee suddenly. So open fellowship has always been something that God warned about. Now, last week we looked at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 11, where Paul talks about not participating with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. And I believe that Ephesians 5:11 addresses several questions that demand an answer. One of the questions is, what does unfruitful deeds look like in our culture or in our current religious climate? The second question had to do is, what is the proper biblical response to those whose practices are in opposition to Scripture? You know, I think we really need to give some thought to that. And then another question is, how does the Lordship of Jesus affect what is unproductive regarding our walk and worship to God. So, what does unfruitful deeds look like in our current religious climate? How does the Lordship of Jesus affect what is unproductive regarding our walk and worship to God? And then the third question is, what is the proper biblical response to those whose practices are in opposition to Scripture? Now, the Bible is clear that the deeds of darkness are not only displeasing to the Lord, they are unfruitful. The vices of the pagan world cannot accomplish anything good. They are sterile, they are futile, they are worthless. So according to Ephesians 5:11, the Christian must do more than avoid sinful deeds. He must actively expose them. To expose means to confront the evildoer and show the wrongness of his act. In classical Greek, this word expose meant to refute the argument of an opponent by presenting clear evidence to expose the facts. Now this is crucial because I'm a gospel preacher and perhaps other gospel preachers are listening. And as a gospel preacher, we can go anywhere and preach the gospel, but you don't go to a group of people who are practicing unbiblical in an unbiblical way and not expose that. You don't go and just be political and preach something that everybody agrees on. No, when you know that they're wrong, before you go, there needs to be an understanding. Hey, I'm a gospel preacher, and I've got to expose error that I'm aware of. Now, let's go back to this word expose and give you an understanding of what is meant. In Leviticus 19, verses 17 and 18, the idea is rebuke your neighbor frankly and love your neighbor as yourself. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, love your neighbor as yourself. In that context, the aim is not to expose the evildoer to the community, but to expose the deeds to the evildoer. So you're not so much want to blast the evildoer to the community, but if you're invited to go and preach to a denominational church, it ought to be understood up front that, hey, I'm here to expose the deeds that I'm aware of. Gospel preachers must remember the charge is not to fraternize with those in error, but to convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. And that's 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse number 2. But we can't point out the problems that exist and not have some solutions. So is there anything that can be done? Is there anything that can be done? I believe so. When we talk about the danger of open fellowship and the culture that we live in now, I think we've got to seek guidance. What I would say to preachers and what I would say to members who are confronted with open fellowship, consult with knowledgeable and trusted religious leaders. Consult with knowledgeable or trusted mentors who can provide guidance and help you discern true teachings from false ones. I need to come back to that because some of us are listening to folk outside our faith. And I see it all the time on Facebook. We're posting these guys who are in error, these guys whose beliefs and practices are different from ours. And we're putting them on a pedestal, but you're not paying attention to knowledgeable and trusted leaders who have built large churches and whose shoulders we stand on now. But you think a guy somewhere else is more biblical or spiritual than someone of your own faith group. Is there anything that can be done? I believe so. Avoid compromise. Be cautious of compromising your beliefs for the sake of fellowship, and in this case, open fellowship. There are doctrinal differences, and doctrinal differences do matter. And you can't overlook doctrinal differences. You can't sweep doctrinal differences under the rug. You just can't say, just believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you just believe that, you're fine. No, that's the starting point. Oh, Lord have mercy. If you look at Acts 8, Philip went down to Samaria and he preached Christ unto them. But he didn't stop there. He also preached the name or the authority of Christ and the kingdom. So if you're going to preach Christ, preach the whole counsel. Death, burial, resurrection. Preach his authority and preach the kingdom. And there is no authority for what denominations are doing in worship now. So you can't have open fellowship and not expose that. And then thirdly, is there anything that can be done? I believe so. Stick to biblical authority. Be sure that your practices and beliefs are supported by Scripture. I've said it earlier, and I want to say it again. There is no biblical authority for the use of instruments in Christian worship. So such practices should be avoided. Why go to a church that is using instruments and you know they're using instruments and you're not going to point that out? The danger of open fellowship is the misnomer that everyone can do what they want and be right with God. The danger of open fellowship is the rejection of absolute truth. The danger of open fellowship is the impression that doctrinal differences do not matter. Be careful not to fall into this way of thinking. There is no room for compromise. There is no room for synchronizing or merging with others who are out of fellowship with God. The prophet Amos said, can two walk together unless they be agreed? If we stick with the Bible, we can be agreed. Well, that's our talk for today. Until next time, may the Lord bless you, and may he bless you real good. God bless you.